Alistair and Oz, it's a privilege to have you here at Coral Ridge this weekend. And I think some could have dubbed this pre-event as the British invasion. I'm kind of flanked here by two Brits. And speaking of that, and these were not on your questions, but Alistair, you are from Scotland. As I said in the sanctuary, hopefully you feel well at home here amongst Presbyterians with your Church of Scotland background. But Oz, I got to ask you, you were born in China, raised in London. You have ancestors that started a brewery in Dublin. So which of the nations do you claim as your own?
I'm very grateful and proud to be an Anglo-Irishman.
Anglo-Irishman, okay. Good answer. So the first question, I'm actually going to ask Alistair because you're going to unpack this more tomorrow morning. But the subtitle of the conference, Seeking a Biblical Worldview in This Cultural Moment, briefly describe from your vantage point as a theologian, author, and pastor, what exactly is happening in this cultural moment from your perspective?
Well, what is not happening is perhaps we could answer it quicker that way. Well, I think what is happening is that in many ways the chickens are coming home to roost from the great advances or declines of the 1960s. I mean, we can go back beyond that if we choose, but in terms of, in the context of, let's just say, the Beatles, were they representing the culture? Were they redefining the culture? They were probably doing a bit of both. But at least in the 60s, there was still a sense of moral oughtness. There was still a sense of rectitude, if you like. There was an understanding that what they were seeking to do was to push beyond the boundaries. And today, I would say that the boundaries are gone, that there are no boundaries. So what is the culture today? It is the epitome, I think, of the cult of self-expression. I am who I want to be, and therefore it is a total disregard for God as creator or of a sovereign God who orders the events of the universe and of our lives. And so the culture today, Western culture, is we live in an upside-down world where, you know, the prophet Isaiah talks about truth has fallen in the public square, and a sense of delusion seems to have gripped the hearts and minds of people. And so it's a privileged time to be involved.
Without giving too much away from your talk tomorrow, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I will be tackling it tomorrow, but I want to argue that we're at what's called a civilizational moment, which is an incredibly important moment for, first, the Western civilization, which is really towards the end, but also towards the crisis of the American Republic. Because America is as deeply divided today as at any moment since just before the Civil War. So both for the West and for America, this is an incredibly important moment. And the key people are people of faith. That's why we're here.
Oz, let's stick with you on this next question. So we're out here, we're talking about biblical worldview. If you're a member here of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, it's something we talk about a lot. But practically speaking, we go on and we go out to our lives, we go to business, we're in school, and in our everyday lives, how do we navigate life in this cultural moment with a distinctively biblical worldview?
Let me go back on that one. If you look at the American crisis, the scandal is the church. Because if you look at our Western European countries, there's no country in which the church is a significant majority. We're all minorities and insignificant. But here, the Christian community is the largest community in America. And if you compare us with, say, our friends the Jews, they're 2% of America. They describe themselves as smaller than the tiniest statistical error in the Chinese census. And yet they punch well above their weight. intellectually, culturally, financially, and we're a majority, and we're called to be salt and light. And we're simply not at the moment. So the deepest thing we need is revival and reformation within the church itself. And I'd start there.
Speaking on that, the statistics show us that Christians inside of the church in North America that have a biblical worldview, it's around 10%. That means the majority of North American Christians are making decisions about everyday life without a biblical framework. As a pastor, why is that? Why is the number so low?
Well, probably because we as pastors are not doing a very good job on that. That we are perhaps unfolding the scriptures in a way that doesn't fuse the horizons, if you like. The first horizon between an understanding of the text and the mind of the minister, and then from the mind of the minister to the person in the pew, but then from the person in the pew to realize that this actually impacts everything about them and in every way, in the matter of science and in education and the arts and so on. And I think as pastors, it probably, I mean, you're mentioning that your congregation here would be able to respond to that because you address it. And I think that's in large measure what needs to be done. And so a conference like this presumably is helping to that end. But we have to join the dots for people. We can't assume that our congregations are making the link between, studies in 2 Samuel and what it means to be a research scientist at the Cleveland Clinic, and how their views of embryonic material are impacted by their understanding of theology. We have to help them to bridge that gap.
Any thoughts on why it's so low in the North American church?
Well, you two are good pastors, and you're exceptions immediately of what we're talking about. But, if you look at the church by and large, it is weak in theology. It's incredibly weak in history. And again, your sort of churches are great exceptions. Unfortunately, the one I go to in Washington is the same. But I'm amazed how people are not interested in history and they're not interested in theology. But of course, let me be more optimistic. If we look at the world crisis today, the alternatives are truly bankrupt. And if ever the good news of the gospel was the best news ever, it is today. And so Christians need to get off the back foot. So many in this country are defensive. There's a state of siege, and there are ex-evangelicals and the rising nuns and all this sort of stuff. This is an incredible moment for the gospel. And we need to give people hope and confidence and courage.
That's good. All right, let's talk even more specific, though. So you hear often people say either the gospel is a deeply personal and private message. It's me and Jesus. It affects my relationship with him. Your religion's good, just keep it to yourself. What is the wake-up call specifically for Christians, and why should they take the message of the gospel as it's found in the pages of Scripture, and why does it relate to everyday life?
I'm an evangelical, unashamed and evangelical. With all the tarnishing and the ex-evangelicals and all that, I am an unashamed evangelical. But we have to say that one of the weaknesses of evangelicalism is a lack of a really solid Christian worldview and a public philosophy. So up till about 1970, many evangelicals in this country were what's called privatized. They had a faith that was privately engaging, publicly irrelevant. And many evangelicals were out of it. I first visited this country in '68 as a tourist. And I only met one major evangelical leader who understood what was happening in the incredible things of the '60s, and that was Carl Henry. But when evangelicals woke up, not in the '60s, but in the early '70s, Roe v. Wade and so on, many swung from an overly privatized faith to an overly politicized faith, as if politics was the be-all and end-all of everything. And there wasn't a balanced view of the whole counsel of God touching the whole of life. And that's still a terrible weakness, and why there's a huge rejection of evangelicalism, because we've been tarnished with that sort of political activism. So an overly privatized faith is weak. The Lordship of Christ covers everything. But equally, an overly politicized faith is wrong, because you probably know that idea that politics is the be-all and end-all of everything came from Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the French Revolution. That is not a biblical idea. Politics is incredibly important, but in its place.
That's good. Alistair, anything to add to that?
Well, no, I mean, just the idea that Christian faith is personal, but it is not private. And I think some people are increasingly privatized now out of fear, as Oz is saying. Not all are on the back foot because they are unwilling, but because they're fearful, especially now that we've entered into this peculiar kind of world where the normal use of language as it relates to all matters moral and sexual has been turned upside down, and people realize that their biblical worldview does not allow them to accede to that kind of thing. And so you can understand why, you know, these guys have been writing these books like the Benedict Option to say, you know, the very reverse of what we would want to be saying, and that is, let's go away and hide up a high hill. And I think Oz is absolutely right. I've been here now for 38 years, and I dread these jolly elections because every time they come around, there's a phenomenal distraction from the work of the gospel, misunderstood as a political agenda, whatever your position is. And consequently, the idea of being able to engage in a culture that is crumbling with the greatest adventure that a young person could ever know, the voice is silenced because the voice is being used to another end. And I agree with what my brother says here.
With the rise of technology, advancements of social media, pervasiveness of the entertainment industry, the next generation is being inundated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. How are those advancements in our culture impacting this next generation?
Well, most of the things that would have taken a long, long time to be communicated when I was a teenager are now communicated instantaneously, and not simply throughout the school, but throughout the state and the nation and the world. The good news is that, because we don't want to be Luddites, I don't think, when it comes to the matter of technology, the good news is that the technology provides us with an opportunity to seize. And one of my friends was telling me that the number one on the Apple apps is Uverse, with millions and millions of people that are plugged in there. But I think the danger of it is that it is a very accessible world. You can see it in relationship to men's problems with pornography. You can see it in relationship to teenagers being inculcated in schemes and dreams that they would never have been able to access otherwise. But once again, it's for us to seize the opportunity, to take the moments that are available. And some of us are trying to experiment as best we can by doing just that.
Your thoughts on the advances in technology and social media and its impact?
Well, clearly part of the problem of the West is that our technology is far outstripped our morality, and that's a huge problem. But we've got to get people to recognize we're called by our Lord to be in the world, but not of the world. And people have a very shrunken view of worldliness, and they don't recognize what it is. So we've got to bring people up to recognize the world in which they're living if they want to resist it. I was telling the pastors at lunch that a very tiny thing, but when my son was 8 and we moved to this country, we had a little game, Spot the Lie, because I hate a lot of American advertising. And I gave him a quarter every time he could look at a commercial and tell me where the lie was, or the non sequitur, or the irrational appeal. because American advertising is so subtle. And after a while, we called it off. He was getting too much from me. But it taught him to read the commercials and read the ads and so on. Now, we've got to get our people to recognize the world. Now, there was a time when, I'm overweight. But there was a time when many Americans were vastly overweight. And then people started to eat well. But we've got to have the same thing with technology and information, so people know how to take in knowledge and information and news well, and know who's speaking and what are their assumptions and so on, and not to be fooled by it all. Again, I was saying, Skip Stout at Yale says that the Puritans in New England, they had on average 40,000 sermons in a lifetime, and no other voices except these men, the pastors. But now, of course, voices are all around us. And we need to have people who are discerning and understand where the voices are coming from. And I don't want that one, and I'll listen to that one with salt on everything he or she says, and so on. In other words, we've got to be much wiser as to what the world is. When I came to Christ, worldliness was drinking, dancing, and smoking. They were the so-called no-nos, and then came the 60s, and all of them were thrown out. Trivial. But we're profoundly in a world that is shaping us on all sorts of levels. And if ever we needed a deeply realistic, comprehensive view of the world, including what you're saying, Rob, it's today.
All right, just a couple more questions, but I think this one's incredibly relevant to those here at Coral Ridge. One of the things that we talk a lot about is the next generation. This room is filled with parents that have children, grandparents, we have educators here, and if the statistics are true, young adults, when they get to college, are leaving the faith like never before. So what can we encourage our parents and our grandparents? What are the conversations they should be having as their children and grandchildren are going off to college?
Well, one of the things they should be doing is not allowing their children and grandchildren to live with the illusion that their commitment to sport is going to sustain their lives. 90% of them are no good to start with, and the other 10% have only a tiny chance of making it. And what is happening is that American sports, and particularly for children and for teenagers, has made a huge impact on anybody's understanding of the Lord's Day and the understanding of a Sunday. And I do not subscribe to this view that is promulgated by Barna and the rest, that these young people are leaving the church. No. In the vast majority of cases, they were never in the church. They have never sat beside their parents in worship. They have been educated through a gymnasium. And if the youth pastor does not have the guts to teach them the Bible or to explain to them the basis of biblical theology, what they have left behind was not the church, but was a ramshackle experience that took them from the age of 5 to the age of 18. So I want to make a huge plea to people, to parents, to do not allow your children to dictate to you. It's amazing to me, especially young couples. You know, I want you to know that I survived the fact that my parents said, we're going to church. We didn't have a meeting. We didn't have a council meeting, you know, at 4:15 in the afternoon to assess the possibilities. That wasn't even remotely in our thinking. And I survived. The notion today is, if ever you would be, as quotes, heavy-handed with your children as to guide them in that way, you will drive them away. Well, try it. And tell me in 10 years how you've done. I may be old, and I am getting old, but how could I ever replace the experience of sitting beside my father as he opened the Bible for me, and as his hand trembled as he aged, and as me trying to hold it steady for him, and not getting everything out of this sermon, but getting enough out of the sermon. And one of the reasons that young people don't like sermons is the same reason a lot of older people don't like sermons, because there are so many lousy sermons. But the real issue is parents stepping up and deciding what is most important. There is no way in the world that no matter what school they go to and who they row for will matter a rap in the light of eternity in comparison to what it means for them to come to a knowledge of Jesus Christ as a Savior, a Lord, and a King. So the kids that are gone, they were never there. I guarantee you that the kids that are coming through my high school ministry, they are there. Why? Because they were always there. And it's taken me ages to make sure that that happens. Because what I inherited when I came from Scotland was not that. It was, 15 basketballs and a Bible verse. But they didn't know that they weren't Mormons, because they didn't understand the incarnation. They didn't know who the world they were. So they're prey as soon as they go. So don't let them go. Not before you got a hold of them.
Anything to add to that? No, that was pretty
Alistair
good.
did it well, but let me put it in terms of American first principles. And I learned this from a Jewish friend. He said, if any project takes more than a single generation, you need two things: a school and history. Now, you look at that as the Jews say in the Bible. What did Moses talk about the night of the Passover? They're going free. He never mentions freedom. They're going to the promised land of milk and honey. He never mentions it. 3 times he talks about children. Because the story we tell to our children is the key to identity and continuity. Now, that, of course, applies both to faith in the church and to freedom in the republic. But sadly, that transmission has broken down both in the church and in the republic. So in the republic, obviously, the public schools used to Americanize people, and then that was thrown out, civic education, the melting pot, in the 1960s, and in came Howard Zinn, and in came the 1619 Project. That is literally the death of the republic if it continues. But tragically, what used to be called catechism has been lost in many churches, and the Generation Z doesn't have it. They don't have the faith. They don't have the freedom. It is our fault. Transmission has broken down.
Oz, I'm going to give you the last word because this man has to speak later tonight. But you're more than welcome to say more. You look like you're ready to say something.
I was just going to say that what he just said was what I was really trying to say.
Conferences like this that we're going to have this weekend can tend to leave us thinking very pessimistically about the moment. And so I want, if the gospel does bring hope, and the church is the hope of the world, leave us tonight as we begin this conference and kick off this weekend. Why are you still hopeful about the role of the church and the message of Jesus Christ?
Wow. How long do we have? Let me start in the most abstract way. I said this is a civilizational moment for the West. Almost every one of the great historians who says that the key to possible renewal, if we don't go decline, has to be religion. They say religion. Obviously in the West, that's the Christian faith. Is there capacity for renewal, revival? The Valley of the Dry Bones, the resurrection itself, the great historic awakenings. My ancestor, who started our little family firm, came to faith through the preaching of John Wesley in Ireland in late 1730s. My great-grandfather was the lead preacher in the revival in Ireland in 1859, and he was the grand old age of 23. And we have newspaper accounts of his standing on the top of carriages with 25, 30,000 people and no microphone. But the Spirit would fall. And in Ireland, after 1859, in that area where the revival was, there was one recorded crime in the whole place. In other words, we are the people, evangelicals. We believe in the resurrection. We know the valley of the dry bones and how it can come out. And we stand in that great tradition. And so today, prayer and revival and renewal should be urgent. But if you take something else, as I said earlier, I try and look at all the big cultural things against us. Many of them are bankrupt when it comes to the deeply important questions. Take just, say, humanity. The only way to have a high view of humanity is when humanity is understood upwards, made in the image and likeness of God. As soon as you understand humanity downwards, you will degrade and dehumanize. Again and again, we have the answers. Human dignity, truth, freedom, justice, peace. Start unpacking them. We haven't time tomorrow, but I wish we did. How do you solve American racism? The unaddressed, the unresolved, which the radical left is exploiting. All they can do is bring a power conflict to it. We bring the gospel, but who's doing that publicly? In other words, for many Christians I find going across this country, the cross has become purely personal and purely individual and spiritual. Whereas if you look, the Day of Atonement, it was for individual Jews, of course, but it was the answer to the scandal and the blasphemy of the golden calf. It was a national Day of Atonement. What does that mean for America? Because what we're seeing with racism, America's greatest evil is meeting the establishment's greatest blind spot. They haven't a clue how to deal with it. Is meeting the radical left's greatest fraud and danger and meeting the gospel's greatest glory. In other words, forgiveness frees and so on. But we've got to make that case today. This is an incredible moment for humanity. Go out with courage and confidence.
Let me just say publicly to both of you, when I was called to ministry 25 years ago, you were two of the leading voices that I was listening to, following, and 25 years, I know. Yes, explains a lot. But 25 years later, on my worst days in ministry, the hardest days in ministry, you still continue to be the voices. And I just thank God for both of you, for your voice, for your leadership, and your boldness. And let's show these two gentlemen our appreciation.